number 11. And 12. Okay, and number 13 is part of the heel, but I am not going to hang it because we're going to drop it anyway. It's going to be the first stitch that we're decreasing. So I'm going to go ahead and let number 12 knit by putting a little tension on my working yarn and knitting past that sinker post. Now it looks like this stitch is knitting, but it's not, because I just have to let it get past that sinker post, and when it starts to return, I'm going to let number 13 sink a little bit just to get this lined up. And I'm going to pull up a loop that's going to be my wrap. I'm going to hold the stitch marker in this direction with this hook pointing to the outside, and I'm going to grab that loop. That's going to be my wrap, and then I'm also going to come in through the back of stitch number 13 like that, so that I have my wrap on the stitch holder first and my live stitch last. And when I rehang them, this one's going to come off first. That's why I hang them in that order. So you close that, and I'm going to go ahead and sink needle number 12. But I need to size this stitch to where in the future, when I get ready to rehang these loops, it's going to be like that eventually. But I need to size this loop. It's too big right now. I need to snug it up. But this is the needle that it's going to hang on later. So while I've got this anchored, I'm going to pull on my working yarn and line that up just about in front of it there. It doesn't matter if it's a little bit snugger than that, but that's going to make a good tight joint. If you go any tighter than that, you probably won't be able to rehang that. So just try to line this loop up with this needle by holding on to your stitch marker. Now I'm going to continue back to the other side and do the same thing. I don't want to let needle number 1 knit, but I want to let needle number 2 knit. So I'm going to put a little pressure on my working yarn, just a little, just to help that loop drop over that sinker post. And then I'm going to go in the opposite direction, just until needle number 1 starts to sink. And you can see it didn't knit. I did not allow that loop to get into the hook of that needle. So just as it starts to sink enough for me to get that loop off of there, I'm going to do the same thing on this side. I'm going to pull up some slack. I'm going to get a stitch marker, and this time I'm going to point it this way toward the outside edge. I'm going to grab that loop. I'm going to use my hook and grab that stitch off of that needle and poke my stitch holder in through the back of that stitch. And then I'm going to continue in the direction I was going just long enough to sink that needle. And again, I'm going to pull on my working yarn to size the wrap. I'm sizing this wrap to line it up with the needle that it eventually is going to hang on. And that's about right. I'm going to show you the sock that I made that I'm actually cheating a little bit. I'm rehanging another sock, and on this sock is where I made my mistakes. So at the end of the video you'll see that this sock is the one that's actually finished, but you can see on my heel that these wraps are a little bit loose, but I did a little bit better on the wraps on the toe, and they're nice and tight. And this is the technique that I use, so I would suggest making them a little tight, but not too much. So let's finish where I was going. And the next stitch that needs to be dropped is number 12, so I'm going to let number 11 knit by letting my yarn drop over that sinker post. I'm going to put a little pressure on the working yarn, let it drop. Don't let that one sink too far because it'll start stitching that, it'll start knitting that needle, and I don't want it to knit. So I'm reversing back. I'm going to let that needle sink enough to get the loop off of there. I'm going to pull up some slack here, grab another stitch marker, point it toward the outside, grab that loop, and grab the loop that's on that needle and hang it from the back. Let me see if I can get that in the camera better. Put it on the stitch holder from the back. It's hard to keep my hands out of the way. And I'm going to go ahead and return and sink that needle just to hold this loop. And then I'm going to size my wrap. This is the wrap. You can tell by pulling on your working yarn. And I'm going to line it up with the needle that it's going to hang on later. And then continue back. Next needle that needs to drop is number 2, so I'm going to let number 3 knit. Again, I'm going to put a little pressure on my working yarn, just a little tension, and let number 3 knit, and then return. And when number 2 sinks a little bit, I'll pull up a little slack, point my stitch holder that way, grab that yarn off there, and come in through the back of it with my stitch holder. Sink that number 3 needle, resize that wrap to the needle that it's going to hang on later, and go back to the other side. Number 11 needs to be emptied next, so I'm going to let number 10 knit by holding on to this yarn and letting that pop down below that sinker post and not letting this one knit. You see it's not grabbing the yarn, so that's good. I'm going to let that needle sink a little bit because that's the one I need to empty. Pull up some loops there. Going to point my needle, my yarn holder that way, grab that loop, remove the stitch that's on needle number 11 and hang it from behind onto that stitch marker. Return and sink needle number 10. Size that wrap. Oops, that came undone. Size the wrap and continue. So I've got 3 stitches on that side. I don't know why that keeps coming undone. The next needle that I need to empty is number 3, so I'm going to let number 4 knit. Here's number 4. Put a little tension on this yarn so that it'll pop over that sinker post and return without knitting number 3. Pull up my wrap. My holder is pointing in this direction. I'm going to pick up that loop. I'm going to grab the stitch off of that needle, number 3, and place it through the back of the stitch onto that stitch holder. Close that up and then knit forward, sink that needle number 4, tighten up my wrap to where it's even with that, and then I need to drop one more needle on this side, which is needle number 10. So I'm going to put a little tension on my yarn and I'm going to knit number 9. Return. This needle did not knit, which is good. Let it sink a little bit. That's needle number 10. Pull up some slack. My hook is going to be pointing that way. I always want to put the wrap on first because I want my live stitch to come off first when I rehang them. So I'm going to put it on last. Sink needle number 9, tighten up that wrap, or resize it, and continue back to the beginning, and we're going to drop stitch number 4. So I'm going to allow stitch number 5 to knit. Put a little tension on my yarn, let that pop down over that sinker post next to needle number 5, and then return without needle number 4 knitting. But I'm going to let needle number 4 sink a little bit to get that stitch off of there. Pull up a wrap, point my holder this way. Remove that stitch from the back onto this holder. Sink number 5 by knitting forward. Resize that wrap. And now we're going to start the increasing. I've already started back in the other direction. We're going to start rehanging those stitches one by one until we increase back out again. Okay, I'm going to continue back in the direction I was going. Number 10 is the first needle that needs to be rehung. So I'm going to keep my eye on number 10, and just as that needle, the hook pokes up past these little teeth, it'll be sufficient for me to hang that stitch. You don't want to go too far. So keep a little tension on the yarn. And I've almost gone too far. So the number 10 is, the hook is just above those little teeth down there. So I'm going to open up my stitch holder, and it's pointing in the same direction I used a while ago. I'm going to take that stitch off and put it back on in the same direction I took it off. And I'm also going to do the same thing with this wrap. And you see it's a little snug. To get it over that needle, but I can borrow a little bit by tugging, or shoving that knot down a little bit, and I can get it over that needle. and it's going to be more snug than the last method I used on that first video I made. Now, even though that stitch isn't, I can't get it down to the base right now, I need to knit this needle, so I'm going to have to go past this ankle post anyway. So I'm just going to crank forward until that needle gets up a little higher, and then it's going to allow me to get those stitches down. And I'll use my hook to help it past the sinker post and down around those teeth down there. And I'm going to go ahead and finish knitting it. Always remember to finish the process. And I'm going to put a little tension on the yarn, let it snap down below that sinker post. These two empty needles are going to come back up. I'm going to help that down to the base again. And as I'm knitting that needle on the return, I'm going to snug up this yarn there on the end just a little bit. And I'm going to do the same thing on this side. The next needle that needs to be hung is number 4. So just as number 4 starts poking up above the little teeth, I'm going to rehang those stitches. So I'm going to keep my eye on needle number 4, and now I can open up this stitch holder, grab my live stitch, the knit stitch first, and hang it on there, and then grab that wrap. And while it's on the stitch holder, I can kind of push down a little bit to lengthen it, to make it easier to get on that needle. So I'm going to take it off the stitch holder and hang it back on the needle it belongs on. It's going to be doubling up with the knit stitch that's down there. I'm going to have 2 loops on that needle. So again, I need to finish the process. I need to finish knitting these needles. So I'm going to continue, and I'm going to help that drop down all the way around those teeth. I'm going to knit past this sinker post and return. And these needles are not knitting. So I always like to help it along right there. So let me go ahead and return a little bit more and snug that up. I always like to look at where I'm going. Number 11 is the next stitch that needs to be hung, so that's where I'm heading. And the hook is opening out this way. I'm going to rehang the live stitch first. And then the wrap. And I can stretch that wrap out a little bit. I'm going to finish knitting this needle and returning and snugging that stitch up a little bit. And I need to rehang stitch number 3, so I'm going to let that needle poke up. And my stitch marker is opening up this way. I'm going to reach behind that stitch, rehang it, and behind the wrap. I'm going to finish knitting this needle. Go back to the other side, snug that up. Next needle is 12, and as it's poking up, I can grab that off of there and rehang it. And the wrap, I can stretch it out a little bit and rehang it. Finish knitting it and go back. Number 2 is the next one. It's just poking up. My holder is opening out that way. I'm going to reach behind the stitch and rehang it on there and behind that wrap. I need to stretch that out a little bit. Finish knitting it. Go forward. Snug that up if you need to. Next needle is 13. That's the last one on this side. So let it poke up. Put the live stitch on first. And then the wrap. Finish knitting it. Go back to the beginning. Needle number 1 is what I'm watching out for when it comes up. I'm going to open this out, rehang the knit stitch, and then the wrap. Stretch that out a little bit. Finish knitting it, and I'm ready to rehang the foot.